Privyet, fellow space enthusiasts. In 1969, during a visit to the United States, Valentina Tereshkova stated,
I am a woman first, a cosmonaut second.
The fact that she was both during the 1960s is a remarkable achievement, given the fact that since the dawn of the space age, it had been a male-dominated preserve. So what happened to open the doors to space to Tereshkova? Let's take a closer look. In the very early days of the space race, both the Soviet Union and the United States were engaged in a battle to conquer space. Into this arena stepped the Cold War warriors known as astronauts and cosmonauts. In regards to their spacecraft, the two sides took differing approaches, with the Soviets favouring ground-controlled spacecraft that reduced their occupants to passengers for much of the time. The Americans gave their space pilots control of their spacecraft, which meant they needed test piloting skills, accumulated flying time in high-performance jet aircraft, and an engineering background. The kind of missions both sides were allowed to fly were heavily influenced by their leadership, but in very different ways. After the victory of Sputnik 1 and the worldwide praise of Yuri Gagarin's mission, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev pushed for further missions to claim firsts and records, because it allowed him the opportunity to boast about the communist system and to belittle his Cold War enemies. As Deborah Cadbury wrote in her book, Space Race, for Khrushchev, space was principally a vehicle for showmanship. The Americans, on the other hand, could fly whatever missions they needed to, as long as they progressed the program forward towards the goal of putting a man on the moon before the end of the decade. To this end, they took the more pragmatic approach of a step-by-step process, with each mission building upon the knowledge and experience of the previous missions. Of these two approaches to space exploration, only the Soviet program could accommodate a one-off mission to fly a woman with a minimum amount of cost and disruption. This is because no woman at that time met the requirements to be an American astronaut, and whereas the Soviet program could go off in any direction, the step-by-step progression of NASA's missions did not allow for the inclusion of a flight that offered nothing to its overall goal. One thing that both programs had in common was the fact that neither side considered including women amongst the ranks of their space explorers. So what happened to change the Soviets' mind on selecting a female cosmonaut? In the United States during February 1960, a doctor by the name of William Randolph Lovelace II invited renowned female pilot Geraldine Jerrie Cobb to his clinic to take tests originally conceived for the male astronaut candidates. Cobb did well on the testing, and as early as August 1960, Dr. Lovelace was making public statements about the testing, saying, "We are convinced that also women in due time will take part in space travels." Shortly afterwards, Cobb started talking to the press in an attempt to push forward her own campaign to go into space. Suddenly, newspapers in America were full of stories about women astronauts and how Cobb would be the first female into space. All of this press coverage wasn't missed by the Soviets, and they started looking at the idea of selecting a female cosmonaut, purely so that they could beat the Americans. The fact that Cobb was pushing so hard to go into space added some urgency to the Soviet search. Nikolai Kamenin, the director of cosmonaut training, noted in his diary on the 24th of October 1961,
"We cannot allow that the first woman in space will be American. This would be an insult to the patriotic feelings of Soviet women."
What followed was a hastily assembled selection process for suitable female candidates, one of which was a young woman by the name of Valentina Tereshkova. Valentina Vladimirovna Tereshkova, sometimes called Valya, was born on the 6th of March 1937 in a small village called Bolshoy Maslenikova, located 170 miles northeast of Moscow. She lived with her father, Vladimir, her mother, Yelena, her sister, Ludmila, and her brother, Vladimir. At a very early age, she suffered a terrible family loss when her father was killed during the Second World War. Some sources claim that having a father who was killed in the war added to her appeal later on with the Soviet hierarchy, but he didn't die fighting the Nazis. He was killed in the Soviets' winter war with Finland. This campaign is viewed as a humiliating defeat of the Soviet forces and added to Hitler's overall poor impression of the Soviets' fighting capabilities, which encouraged him to invade Russia. To better raise her children, Yelena moved her family to the city of Yaroslavl because it offered better work opportunities. Yaroslavl now houses the impressive Valentina Tereshkova Planetarium in her honour, but during her childhood she had an impoverished start to life, calling herself
One of the generation of war children who eat our toys.
As a teenager, she started working at a tyre factory to help contribute to the family, but it was at the cost of her preferred career of becoming a railroad engineer. From here, she went on to work as a textile worker in a textile mill. Not the career she wished for, but one that would be advantageous to her later on. When she was 22, she made her first parachute jump. Tereshkova said of her parachuting,
I learned to wait as long as possible before pulling the cord, just to feel the air. 40 seconds, 50 seconds, it's not falling. You experience enormous pleasure from the sensations of your whole body. It's marvelous.
It was a passion that would change the entire course of her life and propel her from the masses to the elevated heights of rubbing shoulders with queens and presidents. Why was her parachuting skills so important? It was a secret that was kept for many years. After being given the go-ahead to select a female cosmonaut group by the Soviet government in December 1961, the Soviet space program began the screening process for suitable candidates. Under the cover story of joining a parachute program, Tereshkova secretly joined the other candidates for testing in January 1962. So secret was her involvement in the space program that Tereshkova states that her family only found out what the real purpose for her absence from the family home was when a neighbour told her mother that she was going into space. Of the hundreds of women who were tested, only 5 were selected: Tatiana Kuznetsova, Valentina Ponomaryova, Irina Solovyova, Zhana Yurkina, and of course Tereshkova. On the 16th of February 1962, Tereshkova joined the ranks of the newly established Female Cosmonaut Corps and said of them,
We were all young. We were just burning with desire to go to space.
In his book, From Laika with Love, Dr. Dwayne Graveline wrote, Tereshkova was not truly integrated into the cosmonaut detachment and not considered for flight assignments on an equal basis with the male counterparts. The Soviet leadership considered flights of women into space only to be for propaganda purposes. If any further proof of the real motive behind the decision to choose a female cosmonaut was needed, Kamanin wrote in February 1962,
The main goal of such accelerated preparation, IC, is to prevent the Americans from getting ahead of us in order to continue to delay the world with our successes in space.
It was this desire by the leadership that may have been another reason for the selection of a female cosmonaut corps. The Soviets were running out of ideas for novelty flights, as Boris Chertok, an engineer in the Soviet space program concerned with control systems, noted,
The memory of our sensational space fleets was fading, and rather than a routine project, political considerations demanded a new space sensation. The fly of a woman might be just that.
Tereshkova started her cosmonaut training and soon realized there was no time to lose. She later said,
We didn't have rest days or weekends, because we had to get ready as fast as possible, so we could beat the Americans, who were also racing to send a woman into space.
Of course, the Americans had no plans to send a woman into space. As Neil Thompson states in his book, Like This Candle, NASA officials still valued scientific considerations above any social statements they might make. The Soviets were, in fact, in an intense race to send the first woman into space with no one, except for maybe Jerrie Cobb, who was by now taking her campaign to the highest levels of the US government. After completing her training, Tereshkova was made a junior lieutenant in the Soviet Air Force in December 1962. With the female cosmonauts ready, it now needed to be agreed upon what kind of mission they would fly. At first, a joint flight of 2 women was considered, but in April 1963 the decision was taken to fly a joint flight of Vostok 5 with a man and Vostok 6 with a woman. There was only one more thing to be decided: who would be the cosmonaut for Vostok 6, and therefore the first woman into space. Problems encountered during the training ruled out Kuznetsova and Yurkina, so the choice was between the 3 remaining candidates: Ponomaryova, Solovyova and Tereshkova. Unlike the American space program, where one man had the responsibility for putting the crews together, in Russia a number of not only people but organizations had a say. This may have had an influence on some of the critical accusations made about Tereshkova after her flight. Dr. Vladimir Yazdovsky, a physician in the Soviet space program, revealed that the Institute of Aviation and Space Medicine had conducted an evaluation of the female cosmonaut candidates based on various parameters. Tereshkova came out on the bottom. Members of the Academy of Sciences wanted Ponomaryova to go. Russian author Anton Perushin noted that, "I have no doubt that Ponomaryova was the best fit for the first female flight." The State Space Commission, on the other hand, wanted Tereshkova. In May, the decision was made. Tereshkova would be the prime crew member for Vostok 6. Solovyova would be her first backup, and Ponomaryova would be her second backup. This order of selection was due, according to some, to the fact that Solovyova had a family who were office workers, while Tereshkova was from the working class, and some considered that Ponomaryova didn't display enough communist thinking in her replies to interview questions. Of the women who were not chosen for this flight, Tereshkova said that,
Probably they were jealous of me, but they never said anything.
For all of the background manoeuvring, Tereshkova, for one, had apparently no doubts in her own ability. One reporter, who asked her if she had been surprised at being chosen, stated that Tereshkova had replied almost scornfully that,
We believe each of us was worthy of being chosen.
In the end, the question of who would be selected to be the first woman into space seems to have been decided as much on the propaganda returns than the suitability of the candidate. Perushin noted that the final decision was made not by specialists but by top-ranking politicians, including Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev believed that Tereshkova would be a better representation of the ideal Soviet woman. The fact that she came from, as one newspaper put it, a modest peasant background weighed in her favour over some of the more perceived competent candidates. All of these things were picked up on by the Western press, who detailed her modest family background, labelling her the daughter of a tractor driver and noting her start out in working life as a textile factory worker. She was a Soviet propagandist's dream. Recalling how Gagarin had dazzled the world with his smile, Kamamin described Tereshkova's PR potential as Gagarin in a skirt. It was a sentiment shared by Gerard de Groot, who wrote in his book, Dark Side of the Moon, Tereshkova was simply a tool of propaganda, just like poor Laika. Unlike Laika, though, they wanted Tereshkova safely back alive. If the flight was purely to achieve another space sensation and claim a first for the Soviet Union, then it vividly demonstrates the lengths they were willing to go to, because if Tereshkova had been killed during this endeavour, it would have been devastating. Fortunately for everyone involved, Tereshkova was more than equal to the challenge. She would receive a dramatic reminder of just how deadly the cosmonaut business was, when on the 28th of May, 1963, the cosmonaut's parachute trainer, Nikolai Nikitin, died in a parachute accident. His death had come only a few weeks before the launch, and Kamamin was concerned about its effect on Tereshkova, but preparations went ahead. On the 11th of June, Sergei Korolev, the Soviet chief designer, spent a couple of hours with Tereshkova to see if she was psychologically ready for what she was about to do. With no hesitation or reluctance on her part to go, Tereshkova was given the all clear for a date with destiny. On the 16th of June 1963, Tereshkova put on her protective garments and prepared for her space mission. An interesting piece of trivia from her flight is the fact that she wore the first mission patch. The patch had been designed as a surprise for her and undoubtedly shows the universal symbol of peace, a dove carrying an olive branch. Tereshkova's call sign, though, was Seagull, and this is the bird she would state was shown on the patch. There have been a lot of rumours about Tereshkova's performance during Vostok 6, with both Korolev and his deputy Vasily Mishin stating that she had been adversely affected by the space environment. There are even some claims that the mission ran into trouble before it was even launched. At the time, rumours had abound that after Vostok 5 had been launched, another rocket would launch with the world's first woman aboard. When the expected time for the first launch opportunity came and went, without any rocket lifting off, the West wondered why. Tim Furness wrote in his book, Manned Spaceflight Log, that it gave rise to speculation that the intended woman cosmonaut was incapacitated. If that was the case, her place was taken by Valentina Tereshkova. When the next opportunity to launch came, Tereshkova was at the launch pad, fulfilling a date with a bus tyre, as was the tradition started by Gagarin. There are differing accounts of how she felt after arriving at the launch pad, with one Soviet space scientist telling correspondent Liz Fuller-Wright that Tereshkova didn't want to go. Fuller-Wright recalled that when she had been a NASA-funded researcher, the scientist had told her that. At the last minute she panicked, and they had to strap her into her seat, against her will. There is no doubt that if the West had been expecting the Soviets to launch a woman, then it would have been a humiliating loss of face if they had then failed to do so. But would they really have gone as far as forcing her to go? This claim does seem unlikely, because it was a smiling Tereshkova who left the crew quarters and a confident Tereshkova who arrived at the launch pad. Once at the pad, she declared,
Comrade Chairman of the State Care Mission, Cosmonaut Tereshkova is ready for flight.
Up until now, she had been surrounded by people, encouraging her and cheering her on. But now, as the elevator took her upwards towards the waiting spacecraft and she waved goodbye to the people being left below, the realization that she was now about to go into space alone caused her heart rate to shoot up to 140 beats per minute. Leonid Vladimirov, a scientific journalist, claimed that Tereshkova complained of being sick and dizzy shortly before being strapped into the Vostok capsule. Tereshkova later admitted,
I got nervous right before the start. I can't even tell you. It's hard to be first.
Despite this, her voice comms as she waited to launch are those of someone who was ready and excited to go. At one point she can be heard saying,
Everything is normal. I am not a delicate lady. I am ready for launch.
This is Radio Vostok. Here is a special announcement. For the first time in history, a woman has gone up into outer space. The spaceship Vostok 6, piloted by a woman, a Soviet citizen, Jerrie Cobb.
After the rocket had left the launch pad, Tereshkova announced,
We've left, dearest homeland, we've left. See you later.
As the rocket climbed higher and Earth came into view, she reported to the ground,
The Earth is very beautiful. I see a small river. Tell everyone that use every effort and their knowledge to fully carry out their assignment.
As she orbited Earth, Premier Khrushchev told her,
I'm very happy and proud like a father that our young woman, a young woman of the Soviet Union, is the first.
Not everyone was happy by this first space flight of a woman. When Jerrie Cobb was later asked about Tereshkova going into space, she replied that she was,
I was completely disappointed. It was, of course, expected. It's the same thing that we've been saying would happen for 2 years if the United States didn't start training women astronauts, but still when it happened, it was a real bitter disappointment.
The Russian news agency TASS put out a statement. The flight is being made to continue the study of the effect of various spaceflight factors on the human organism, including a comparative analysis of the impact of these factors on the organism of a man and a woman. As Tereshkova aboard Vostok 6 and cosmonaut Valery Bykovsky aboard Vostok 5 circled Earth, they came to within 3.1 miles of each other, but failed to spot each other. But the first female space traveller could be seen back on Earth during broadcasts made on the Soviet state television network. Tereshkova spent her time during the first day reporting to the ground that she was in excellent condition, singing songs, and when there was some discussion about bringing her back down early, she asked for the flight to continue. It is here that her problems may have started. As the mission continued, she suffered from sickness and fatigue. The same Soviet scientist who claimed that she didn't want to go also claimed she was so hysterical that she threw up in space. It's probably closer to the truth to say that her sickness was due to either a case of space adaptation syndrome, more commonly known as space sickness, or to the space food that she had eaten, of which she had said,
The bread was awful. To diarrhea, I didn't eat it. I mainly ate the black bread and two bed onions.
Tired and hungry, she fell into bouts of sleep. In his book, Tracking Apollo to the Moon, Hamish Lindsay wrote, Once during the flight, she did not respond to any of the ground control signals for several hours, and they began to fear for her safety, but it turned out she was very tired and had merely overslept. Extreme fatigue may have affected her responses, but this was interpreted by some as a kind of mental breakdown. Mishin stated that
Tereshkova turned out to be at the edge of psychological stability.
James Schefter wrote in his book The Race, Ivan Spitzer was a tracking site expert during the Vostok flights and said much the same thing. The poor woman was in such a state that her communications over the voice circuit were almost unintelligible. Tereshkova would deny this, saying,
My mental state was the same as on Earth.
The end of her flight saw just as much controversy, with Schefter claiming in his book that although Vostok 5 cosmonaut Bykovsky was scheduled to remain in space for 8 days, he was brought down early despite being in good shape. because Tereshkova was brought down early because she was sick and increasingly unstable. When she was on her way, they had to bring Bykovsky down too, or face reporters' questions about terminating Valya's flight early. The early return of Vostok 5 actually owed more to the spacecraft being placed in an orbit that was lower than it should have been, due to problems with the launch vehicle's upper stage. The end of her journey through space came with a fiery ride back through the atmosphere, and she later recalled,
Through the porthole, I could see glowing flakes flying by from the burning exterior of the capsule.
At an altitude of about 4.3 miles, the hatch jettisoned from the side of the re-entry module as planned, and the ejection seat fired her outside into the air, not long after she was descending by parachute to the ground to complete her mission. Just like every other Vostok cosmonaut, she would be sworn to secrecy regarding this because of one simple fact. In his book, Schefter explains, the reason was political. The Soviet Union wanted a number of flight records to be made official by the FAI, the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, in Paris. The FAI controlled the record book for flight and set the rules. The problem was, under FAI rules, a pilot must stay with his ship from takeoff to landing. Bail out and it doesn't count. Without that decision as a young woman to take up parachuting, Tereshkova would never have gone into space. As she descended on her parachute, it's reported that she was so weakened by fatigue that she didn't have the strength to steer away from a lake, but luckily a gust of wind redirected her away from it. One thing that did happen was that she was hit in the face. The resulting bruise can clearly be seen in photos of her sitting beside the spacecraft. Looking down, she could see the workers in the fields, and she said how,
Naturally when I was descending, with a parachute, the people came towards me.
At the age of just 26, she had completed a spaceflight that had lasted longer than all of the manned spaceflights conducted by the Americans up to that point. One of the first things Tereshkova did upon her return was to take out the gun she had taken with her into space, to prevent the locals who approached from getting too close, because she feared they might take some of her parachute equipment. The place where she returned would later be marked with an impressive statue showing her reaching upwards to space. When she made it back beside her spacecraft, it was a smiling and happy Tereshkova that could be observed, and she later said,
When you are up there, you are homesick for Earth as your cradle. When you get back, you just want to get down and hog it.
Tereshkova did eat food offered to her by the locals who came to see her. She admitted,
When people saw the parachute, they came. The women said, we are going to feed you. They gave me some milk.
This had broken the rules because it affected the study of her diet during her spaceflight, but Tereshkova simply said,
Nothing from a delicatessen can compare simple village food.
She also distributed some of her food to some of the locals who had gathered around her, admitting,
I gave them some space food.
She was later reprimanded for both of these actions, because everything she did was part of a tightly controlled experiment, and now it would be impossible to see what she had consumed in space. Some even accused her of doing this on purpose, to hide just how little she had eaten, and thus preventing them from being able to say she was weakened, and falling asleep so much because she had been fatigued due to hunger. Once the flight was over, reports started emerging about her performance. All of the stories in the West about Tereshkova's functioning during her mission arose because of the secrecy that surrounded the early Soviet space effort. In such a vacuum of openness, all sorts of allegations took flight. As Ponomaryova pointed out,
The простенер наунст victoriously, the job was done completely, the cosmonaut feels good, but some things filtered out. Rumors began to emerge, there were various fantasies.
it would seem that Tereshkova performed okay during her flight, but conditions for her inside the spacecraft were hard, and this took a toll on her. She was in a spacesuit that wasn't perfectly fitting, and she had to remain strapped in her seat for the entire flight. She later said,
On the second day, I felt a nagging pain on my right shin, which became very disturbing by the third day.
Her fellow space traveller, Bykovsky, had been allowed to unstrap himself from his seat and float in the weightless cockpit a couple of times. During the 8-day mission of Gemini 5 and the epic 14-day flight of Gemini 7, the astronauts were also allowed to unstrap from their seats. Plus, Borman and Lovell wore lightweight spacesuits, which they were allowed to alternatively remove as confidence grew during their mission. For anyone who has flown economy on a long-haul flight, they will know how tiring it can be to remain seated for hours on end, The longest flight I've ever been on was around 12 or 13 hours, so I can't imagine how she could have gone over 70 hours plus the couple of hours during the countdown without being able to stretch her legs, have a hot meal, or have someone topping up her drinks. After the flight, Tereshkova said that it would be better if cosmonauts in space could remove their spacesuits. Some of the negative reports made about her may have come from the fact that she had not reported some of the troubles she was having while she was actually in space. Some bouts of sickness she kept secret and only revealed them after the mission. Some doctors believed that she was holding back on revealing even more difficulties that she had experienced in the weightless environment to cover up how she was really affected by her flight. Fellow cosmonaut Ponomaryova conceded that
I think that she made a mistake by not saying so directly and earnestly.
For her part, Tereshkova has denied all of the claims against her performance, stating that her flight was a success. In her defense, Ponomaryova wrote,
I would argue that Tereshkova did all that was required of her.
When compared against her male counterpart, Alexander Babiachuk, the chief of the military medical directorate for aviation of the Ministry of Defense, later reported that
Bykovsky passed through the flywheel during all its phases and did not experience any unpleasant sensations. The same could not be said about Tereshkova. The Metacrew Kermish noted the heightened sensitivity of her vestibular system.
After this flight, Korolev banned any further flights by female cosmonauts. No doubt the knowledge that the Americans wouldn't be sending a woman into space contributed to that decision. For all of the talk of equality between men and women in communist Russia, her fellow cosmonauts welcomed this decision. De Groot wrote, in fact, according to Alexei Leonov, most Russians believe that women should not meddle in what was regarded as men's work. Tereshkova herself is said to have remarked about her fellow cosmonauts.
They hate me, you know.
De Groot wrote that the rest of the cosmonaut corps were angry at the way she demeaned their job, especially when she described flying in space as simple. The reason why Tereshkova may have said this is because the Vostok spacecraft was, for the most part, controlled from the ground. This meant that unlike her American counterparts who required specific engineering and piloting skills, Tereshkova didn't have or need any of those skills. With the flight over, the Soviets milked Tereshkova's flight for all it was worth. Premier Khrushchev taunted his adversaries by declaring,
Look at what she has shown to America's astronauts. She has shown TRM who is who.
The group pointed out, though, that her flight indicated nothing other than that the Soviets were good at embarrassing the Americans. What her flight did manage to do, however, is stoke the discussion of a woman's role in Western society. As one newspaper put it, it may also be that the Soviet Union, where women have achieved a far greater equality with men than they have in most other countries, has determined to add a woman to the list of space heroes of the Soviet Union, simply out of a sense of justice. No matter what anyone says about her, Tereshkova was brave enough at the age of 26 to sit atop a rocket and spend nearly 3 days in space, becoming only the 10th person to orbit the Earth, and she did it alone. The remaining female cosmonauts continued to train for their own space flight, but despite the success of Tereshkova's flight, and Kamamin pushing the idea of another first, involving the group flight of 2 or maybe more women, Korolev would have none of it. The female cosmonaut group was eventually stood down in 1969, and there would be no more flights for women until there was any propaganda value to be gained from it. That next woman was Svitlana Savitskaya, who went into space on the 19th of August 1982, when the Soviets, up to their old tricks, sent her into space to outdo the Americans, who were planning to send their own female astronaut up. As Furness wrote in his book, the fact that no other woman followed Tereshkova into orbit until 1982 lends weight to the assertion that her flight was simply one more stunt in Premier Khrushchev's Space Spectacular campaign. Savitskaya would return to space on the 17th of July 1984 to perform the first spacewalk by a woman, just 79 days before the US astronaut Catherine Cathy Sutherland became the first American woman to walk in space. With her chances of flying in space again all but gone, Tereshkova would still face death one more time during her time as a cosmonaut. On the 22nd of January 1969, to celebrate the success of the joint Soyuz 4 and Soyuz 5 mission, although not on either of the crews, Tereshkova was in the back of a limousine making its way through Moscow for a special event to be held in honor of the two crews at the Kremlin. Suddenly, a gunman started to fire at the motorcade as it passed by, with windows cracking and bullets fatally injuring the driver. Tereshkova dived on the floor for cover. Apparently, Alexei Leonov, one of the other occupants of the car, had been mistaken for Premier Brezhnev, the gunman's intended target. Emerging from the car, Tereshkova was uninjured but badly shaken by the events. The medal ceremony would go ahead and the whole incident covered up for many years. In 1973, Tereshkova claimed to be preparing for a second flight, stating,
I am working for it, and I'm keen on it, because it is my work, but no that has yet been fit for it.
It is interesting to note that around this time there were tests being carried out in support of the selection of women candidates for the Space Shuttle program. Were the Soviets keeping Tereshkova on hand, just in case of a shock announcement regarding a female astronaut? Wherever she got the idea from that she would be going back into space is unclear, because not long after, Georgy Beregovi, the commander of the Soviet cosmonaut, stated,
We train only young men, not women.
Finally, despite holding a high rank in the Soviet Air Force, earning a doctorate in aeronautical engineering, and being an instructor at the Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center, it became clear that it was time to move on. As she later explained,
They forbade me from flying, despite all my protests and arguments. After being once in space, I was keen to go back there.
with her cosmonaut career over, she pursued a career in politics and displayed her strong communist ideological roots. One journalist wrote in 1972, diplomats who have met Tereshkova say that underlining her congenial manner is an unswerving communist spirit and a readiness to unleash verbal barbs against Western nations, including the United States. Tereshkova has never made any attempt to play down her communist roots, stating,
Just as everyone who remembers the Soviet Union, it is a deep personal tragedy for me, that it collapsed.
She has also stated,
It was a great tragedy for all the people. But now we are living in new times, and we need to do everything to make Russia a great country again.
Nowadays, Tereshkova is better known for her staunch support of Russia's President, Vladimir Putin, stating,
I support him in absolutely everything he does. He wants to make our country one of the most important in the world again.
This support has seen her image tarnished for many because of the things she has said and done. Just as America limits the president to 2 terms in office, Russia also sets limits for their president. In March 2020, Tereshkova proposed a change to allow President Putin to remain in power until 2036. Addressing the Russian State Duma, she said,
I propose either to remove the restrictions on the presidential term or to write in one of the articles of the bill the provision that after the updated constitution enters into force, the incumbent president, like any other citizen, has the right to be elected to the post of head of state.
Dmitry Gudkov, an opposition politician, wrote of her proposal. Tereshkova, who still remembers Stalin well, did not disappoint. One critic of President Putin, Alexei Navalny, retweeted, Tereshkova, the first woman who bravely travelled into cosmic cold and darkness, and then brought the entire country there. After making her proposed amendment to the Constitution, many online petitions were started, one of which was entitled, Send Valentina Vladimirovna Tereshkova back to space. The petition in part stated, civil society, in turn, recognizing the merits of Valentina Vladimirovna, asks to send Miss Tereshkova back to space, preferably indefinitely and forever, without the possibility of returning to Earth, since she managed to be an astronaut, better than being a deputy of a representative body expressing the opinion of the people. Tereshkova responded to her critics.
I don't even want to talk about these people who don't love the country.
As well as her support for President Putin, Tereshkova also supports the occupation of Crimea and the war engulfing Ukraine, something that has resulted in the Anti-Corruption Foundation set up by Navalny describing her as a war enabler. Her stance on the war seems in direct conflict with the message of peace that she often expounds on, once saying,
People shouldn't waste money on wars.
Tereshkova's support for a war that, as of today, has resulted in the deaths of an estimated 120,000 of her fellow countrymen is surprising, given the fact that she has experienced both the effect of losing someone close to her in a war and the hardship such a loss brings to the families of those left behind. She said of her own early experiences,
We know the bitterness of that war. My father perished defending our country, and my mother brought up her 3 children.
as a result of her being a member of the State Duma, the lower house of the Federal Assembly of Russia, and her support of the annexation of parts of Ukraine, something she voted in favour of on the 3rd of October 2022, she has been sanctioned by the Office of Foreign Assets Control of the United States Department of the Treasury. Ukrainian journalist Dmitry Gordon states that Tereshkova has even gone as far as to put in a request to Kirill Gundyev, the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, to officially recognise Vladimir Zelensky, the President of Ukraine, as the Antichrist. On the Ukrainian side, the city of Kyiv has renamed the street, once called Valentina Tereshkova Street, as part of its de-Russification policy. The war being fought over control of Ukrainian territory is also putting a strain on international space cooperation. Some projects between Europe and Russia have been cancelled, and the Russians have hinted at ending their participation in joint space efforts with the Americans. It would appear that space cooperation is something Tereshkova is willing to sacrifice, even though she once said,
The only way forward in space travel is for everyone to work together.
Tereshkova's support for President Putin, constitutional changes, illegal territory annexations, and a war that threatens future cooperation in space has made her unpopular with many and tarnished her image as a Russian hero. All of this is very far removed from the woman who once said,
When you're in space, it takes only an hour and a half to circle the Earth. When one is flying around the Earth and admiring all its beauty, one wants to tell the people living on our planet, that blue and shining object as it appears from space, to do everything possible to preserve its beauty. Peace is of paramount importance, not just for us, but for all the people on our planet.
Valentina Tereshkova, a product of Soviet propaganda, role model, fearless explorer, staunch communist, advocate for peace, war supporter. Whatever you may think of her, one title above all others stands out: First Woman in Space. Of this last title, Tereshkova would say,
Anyone who has spent any time in space will love it for the rest of their lives. I achieved my childhood dream of the sky.
I hope you found this video interesting, and spasiba for watching.